environment and energy knowledge. And I'm just getting started on working with Speak and the FAB team on developing an evidence section, or sort of building out the evidence section of the biodiversity website. And so I'm really excited to hear from y'all's experience.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. I'll hand it over next to Beth.
Hi guys, nice to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to learn with and from you. My name is Beth Hand, and I have been in the background of doing leadership and organizational development for a long time. I haven't been steeped in the development community, but I have been on the periphery of it, and more recently have come into the fold. One of the things that I'm always interested in is how we learn. And one of the things I actually went through and did a series of insight interviews not too long, in fact, just wrapped them up and started them before the world changed, and managed to go through, about how people, what their success stories were. And what I found, and these were all international development organizations from small, medium, and large. And what I found was everybody had success stories. So what evolved from it were success practices. I'll end with this. I have worked with about 400 people since the pandemic started in all kinds of organizations. And to a one, the workloads have increased, the stress has increased, the time to pause and reflect. And I don't mean capital P and reflect, capital pause and capital reflect. I mean the time to even pause and think about what we are learning has just not been there. So hopefully there's something I can share from my experience as well as some of those interviews. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Beth. Lexine? Is it Lexine? Is that how it's pronounced?
That's right. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, I'm Lexine Hansen. I'm with Environmental Incentives as well. Melissa and I randomly ended up in the same group. Maybe we should have coordinated in advance, but I actually work on a totally different series of projects than Melissa. So I work with our Measuring Impact 2 project, which is really about improving adaptive management and outcomes across the biodiversity portfolio across USAID. And I lead our work on cross-mission learning. And I'm really interested in these questions of how we go from activity level learning, even if we can get activities away from just monitoring data, right? If we can actually get into learning, and then how we build that into learning that is shared and reproduced and spread. And we've done a couple of interesting assessments that we've learned a little bit from, but I'm just really excited to hear from others, what is working and how you get to the success practices, and then how you convince other people to use the success practices when they really want to use what they already know. And then also, if we have a chance to also get into how we spread practices in ways that people understand and hear and learn from them. If I have to write another 20-page report with the ubiquitous lessons learned and recommendations that nobody except your client reads, and they pretty much only read it to copy edit it, I swear I'm going to pull out all my hair. So very excited for this conversation.
Well, excellent. Thank you for joining and for the description. And yes, I can appreciate the frustration when it's only copy edited, and sometimes not even that. With that, Roxanne? Do you want to introduce yourself, or you're still on mute?
There we go. Hi, I'm Roxanne Ward, and I have a tremendous interest in organizational learning. I most recently finished with, well, not the most recent project, but one of the larger projects was with the Philippines. And we had a very interesting time with e-learning and developing a system that was nationally implemented. And it required learning on a variety of different sectors, different groups of people and teams. It required sharing between teams and also some electronic monitoring that actually could result in organizational learning. So it was a really interesting process that it's sustained, it's still going today. And so that's very interesting to me to see how something like that can live on. My interest actually started with my preparing my dissertation, and then I did a postdoc in knowledge management. So I I'm very interested, and sometimes I slip into the theory of knowledge, organizational learning, and then also neuroscience, Zachary. I mean, very interested in adult learning, and that has to do with lessons learned as well. So you mentioned that about on an individual level, on an organizational level, and then kind of as an industry. Anyway, I'm interested in all those levels. So if I talk a little bit too much academically, just shut me down. But I think it applies to everything we've talked about here.
Cool.
So thank you. Thanks for involving me.
Alina?
Hi, everybody. I'm Lena Zaskowski, and I've had a long history of working in international development for different contractors and NGOs. But currently I work as an independent consultant. And obviously the lessons learned issue comes up a lot, but very interestingly, my current client is a private foundation that is based in a different country who is interested in sort of cross learning with, especially in the US, because they haven't really worked with anybody in the US. And so I have an interest in also this sort of cross-cultural learning, as well as looking at it from an organizational viewpoint, which is why I wanted to be in this discussion, where I think that there is a lot of opportunities, especially now because so many things are happening online, and that was part of that. Also, this all these conferences and communities of practice that have moved into doing everything virtually, and what kind of effect that will have in terms of doing this organizational learning is interesting to me. So thanks for having this.
Yep. Oh, thank you all for joining and introducing yourselves. It's quite a diverse series of interests tied together, hopefully through organizational learning. So what I'm going to do is kind of give the outline of what we're seeking to achieve within RFS, and kind of get have an understanding with you of that, and then we can discuss perhaps the challenges that we either see in common or ones that we want to focus on as a group. So I really want this to be, peer learning for all of us, as opposed to my issue and peer learning for my selfish reasons. And hopefully in that discussion, we can, each get something out of it. And so we've, within RFS and previous to that BFS, have had, a challenge of how do we learn across the Bureau. And there are specific, kind of pause and reflect moments that we normally would take during the course of a year, portfolio review being one of them, where we're kind of looking at the series of activities that we were doing, understanding if we're hitting targets, indicators, and the like, and what are the challenges and so forth. However, what we've often discovered, and perhaps, many of you have the same experience, is that we get really into just the numbers, perhaps, and, just, did we hit the target? Was it above? Was it below? Is there an explanation? Yes or no? And then we talk about the budget. Do we, increase this budget or decrease that budget? And then that's really the kind of the gist of the portfolio review. Yes, maybe at the end we have kind of an actions list or to do, but it's often a challenge to have that follow-up around the actions and who's responsible and so forth. And so the learning can often be just at the individual level and not really shared out with the group. Part of what we're trying to do now is develop what we're calling kind of the big picture, is the evidence cycle. And this is really kind of laying out and looking at our processes as a bureau and where we need to interject kind of evidence and knowledge, and for decision-making purposes and for application, and what our standard processes are and where we can get evidence. And then based on that sort of that cycle, begin to sort of implement those points where we're kind of taking in evidence, where we're doing analysis, where we're doing synthesis, and then where we kind of feed that out and identifying the audiences for which that knowledge and evidence is supposed to be going. It is going to be a kind of a multi-year task as it stands. Part of what our first level of effort is really to establish our evidence base for our kind of main sectors. And so the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security have 4 main centers, which are the Bureau for Resilience, the not Bureau, the Center for Resilience, the Center for Ag-Led Economic Growth, the Center for Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene, and then the Center for Nutrition. And so each of those is kind of its own domain unto itself, really. And what we want to do is to understand, okay, for these different areas, what are the interventions, really the strategic approaches that we are promoting as the ways to kind of move us towards our higher level objectives. And then below the strategic objectives are the programmatic approaches, the sort of more at the getting towards the way, the activities that we do in order to achieve those strategic objectives, and really outlining that, and then going and doing an evidence aggregation around each of those and sort of getting to a common understanding, and then the evidence aggregation, and then using that as our framework for our discussions around where do we want to learn more, where do we want to capture knowledge, how do we want to look for it, and structuring that, and then using that within the process of portfolio reviews in terms of budget decisions and the like. So for instance, thinking in terms of budget, being able to map out how is our spending versus what we actually have as strategic and programmatic approaches, and is it in line with what we're saying we need to do in order to achieve those objectives, and then making sure that our budget aligns with that and sort of tracking that. And so various different levels of decision making and sort of making sure that that evidence is feeding into that. And so that's kind of, in a very large nutshell, what we're striving to achieve. And then really thinking about after action reviews, the portfolio reviews, and other sort of data collection and analysis, and how that fits into that cycle, and then who along that cycle we're really trying to touch. And so, of course, the challenge is implementing that within a culture that hasn't necessarily seen something that quite so structured previously. And then how do you engage with folks within the organization to actually take up some of those different ideas? With that, I got to make sure I make sure I keep an eye on the chat box. So if you need to interrupt me, raise a hand, wave, or put something in the chat box. And so, Roxanne, you've said when you talk about programmatic approaches, are they high level or are they specific and technical approaches? So the strategic ones are kind of really, strategic approach level is almost at the kind of objective, the overall objective, high level objective level. The programmatic approaches are kind of closer to intermediate result level, maybe a little higher than that. We're trying not to, the challenge with our evidence cycle and the strategic approaches and the programmatic approaches and the like is that each of these different areas has their own, often they are own frameworks that go along with them. So Feed the Future has its own framework. The global nutrition strategy has its own kind of framework. Resilience has more of a looser framework, and water also has its own framework. And so we don't want to supersede those. We want to be in line with those. And so their objectives are really the higher level objectives. And we're trying to slot this down below in the sense of these are the things that are going to feed up into that. So yeah. Oh, I'm being reminded, have I assigned someone to take notes? I was just kind of giving the overview. What I wanted to do in terms of notes, actually, when we kind of get into the discussion was, I'm going to share out a link to a Google Doc. And so as we kind of go through, and let me know if you are able to enter that Google Doc. As we go through the discussion, we can capture it as individuals if everybody has access to it. And that way we don't have an individual note taker per se. One thing I will ask though is who wants to take on the role perhaps of being the readout person? Any volunteers? Roxanne, are you willing? Sure, okay, cool. We had someone join, Denise. you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure, thank you. I was listening to the introductions, and I'm very happy to be part of this group. I am with the Organization of American States, so we touch some of the international development issues, not fully there. I'm in the organizational development section just about 3 years now, and I come from the project unit where a lot of the learning was very much at the project level or reporting to donors or lessons learned captured there. And now I'm struggling with how do you communicate that out to the wider group? How do you get it beyond the group to another mission that's similar or across the organization? So a lot of what you're saying resonates with me. Thank you.
Sure, cool. Thank you for joining us. So let me know, I see some folks in the SID Washington Lessons Learned Google Doc. Let me know if you can't access the link. I tried to make sure that it was open to everyone. So noting that some of you have mentioned the challenges, one of the first things I wanted to do, kind of as I've laid out our sort of struggle and our sort of challenge, is what are the challenges that you're facing around that? I know some of you have talked about it in your introduction, but to just kind of document it there. Then the next piece, what we would do is kind of talk about the 3 pieces of the cycle that Barbara kind of mentioned in her introduction. You know, thinking about within these contexts, how do we collect the lessons learned at an organizational level? And then kind of what are the challenges and what are the solutions that folks are finding in terms of that? And then for another step, we would do, you know, how do you shape the lessons learned and write them such that people are, you know, understanding and are more inclined to take them up? And then how do you get staff to use lessons learned? So you've collected them, you've put them into a good package, you know, you've synthesized them, or, you know, you've turned them into infographics to the like. How do you get staff to use them? And then an additional question to that is, how do you measure whether or not they're effective? How do you know people are taking them up? And kind of as we go through this, to, you know, as each of us kind of comes to this question, maybe we have an example, we can put those in there and just sort of note that this is a way someone has done it, and we can connect that way. Does that seem reasonable to folks? And that way we kind of distribute the note-taking responsibilities, and everyone sort of knows that their wording is as close to what they want to say as possible. Thumbs up? Cool, excellent. So just to take, you know, a minute or two and take a look at in that challenges area, and then write out what the challenges in terms of your organizational learning or questions that you'd really want to answer that you're facing. And just take about 2 minutes to write those down if you haven't already. Cool. So we'll just take a look at the challenges that folks have highlighted. I kind of see a couple of buckets in the sense of it's that challenge of moving from the silos of the teams to kind of the larger learning that I'm sort of seeing, and sharing lessons learned beyond project teams. How do you get the staff in Burundi to take the lessons from the staff in Brazil, and how to apply them? Articulating the lessons such that at the end of the project it goes to the next project, and it's not just or beyond the next project. That's often a challenge as well. And getting people to share what didn't go well. Another one I'm seeing is like, who reserves resources for learning, who pays for it, who staffs it, the ownership of this process. Because something like a learning cycle, I'll tell you right now, it is taking a team, and I don't even think we're sufficiently staffed to kind of take all of that on. So kind of getting at some of that in terms of the sharing the lessons and kind of moving beyond the team, and recognizing that sometimes our mental state is to focus on what's that next step. And so I kind of refer to the USAID did an evaluation, or kind of looked at the use of evaluations by USAID staff. And what was interesting was that I think there was a sense that maybe we weren't using evaluations, performance evaluations, impact evaluations in our decision making. And what you found was that 80 to 90% of people who were surveyed during that report, for that report, said, no, we're using the evaluations. We're using this information to inform our follow-on mechanism. And so it was like the knowledge was going from that one project to the next project, and it was informing that. But there wasn't any kind of broader organizational learning. It was very specific to perhaps a unit or a team, and not necessarily getting beyond that. I was wondering, what have folks tried? What has kind of resonated, or have you seen tried with others that kind of gets at this transfer of knowledge from team to team? Any thoughts? And this is kind of going to that question, that next question: how do you collect lessons learned at an organizational level?
Right. If I may, Zachary.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that and it's so informal, and it probably happens everywhere, is that informal exchange. A new mission is coming on board. They want to set up. They talk to somebody from another one and find out, how do we do this? What did you do? But it's a very informal so far, and not very structured process. And we're trying to figure out, and how do you do that in a way that's more structured. But the in-person it has a lot of the demand and supply feature. You ask for what you need, and you get it. It's very focused, it's very targeted. And so to some extent, it's effective, but limited.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate you saying that, Denise. One of the things that I have observed is that there's this focus on a product and a process that results in the product, but not the process, if you will, of learning. And even Zachary, when you first said, how do we as a bureau learn? I had a completely different understanding of what we might be discussing in here versus looking at lessons learned. I see kind of that, if you will, a technical bias a lot of times in the development sector. It's easier to measure, did we do it, didn't we, do we have this meeting, versus this free flow, if you will, Denise, of exchange, where we get to pause, we get to have some reflection, we get to ask questions, not just to produce a product.
I agree, Beth, and that I think is a major challenge, especially when it is part of many people's jobs to actually count the products, and that is seen as how you achieve. Whereas something that is like knowledge, which is an intangible, much more difficult to kind of measure and understand, what's the impact of those kind of exchanges. Roxanne, did you have something?
Right. I wanted to see, I know in the health sector, the CFIR, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, one of the things in terms of how you can replicate, and we have been able to replicate in many projects, and that is you identify the pieces that are the core elements, and this could be done in a lessons learned, this could be done in a database or whatever, but the core elements that cannot be changed, and then those elements that are adaptable to the environment and to the resources available. So adaptation. Instead of just saying this is the lesson, it's like structuring how lessons are spoken about and what's been learned.
Yeah, no, that's very effective. I mean, that's kind of the feedback. I don't know how others have felt, but a lot of feedback we often get, and I think is the result of having the lessons learned subject area, is that we're not often providing examples of what the lessons learned are, or what the key pieces of what we think the learning is, and how do we integrate that. So one thing I had heard, I think is it IFC? The person leading their knowledge work recognized this as an issue, and she went out and did a survey of folks to say, what do you think of when you say lessons learned? And really looked across their organization and trying to understand, all right, when we say lessons learned, or when we ask for a lessons learned from people, what are they thinking that we want to hear? You know, what are they thinking in responding to? And then based on that, and based on what, you know, understanding what they as an organization wanted to learn, started to restructure and think about how they do lessons learned, and really providing examples, concrete examples of this is what we see as a lesson learned out to folks to be able to get back what they really want to see in terms of an organization. Have others seen an approach to the point of recognizing that there's kind of these two pieces that I see as kind of running in parallel? It's that what kind of Denise is highlighting, that exchange of networks between individuals that's really sort of allowing knowledge to flow, kind of what Barbara was talking about in terms of knowledge flows, but then also kind of having the knowledge base, kind of to what Roxanne is talking about, and what, you know, IBM did so well, you know, years ago, in the sense of having this knowledge repository that is constantly being updated, that people can go to and find out, you know, the documented lessons learned. And how do you run those sort of things in parallel? Do folks have examples of one or the other? I mean, Roxanne had got one up. Lexine, sorry, your hand disappeared behind your background.
Yeah, it does. You kind of have to figure. It's very fun. No, so I have an example that kind of, we do a little bit of both of those things. So FAB has hired us, and we've been doing this for about the last 5 years, to manage their collaborative learning groups. So there are, we started with 1 or 2 about 5 years ago, and now we built up to 6 that we are either starting or managing. And what has worked really well in those learning groups is staff have really, they've volunteered to be engaged. They see it as a place where they can come together and learn, but we also created a learning framework around them. So collaboratively, we developed an understanding of the theory of change that sort of underpins whatever that group is. So one of them is conservation enterprises. And we developed a theory of change that says, what are the steps in creating a conservation enterprise, and how do we get from, you know, step 1 to no more killing the animals in the forest, or, you know, whatever kind of the outcome is. And then we developed a learning agenda based on that theory of change, with questions for all the assumptions that link each of those links in that chain. And it's a high level theory of change. There's only 5 kind of broad learning questions, but it frames people so that they know, what are the key questions I do want to figure out in my activity? Where is my activity along this theory of change? And where can I provide examples to others about what we're doing? Or where am I struggling, and who else is in a similar place and can help me? Or who has gone past this, and how can they help me? And we manage, that group has online like spaces where we consolidate, you know, the reports and the documents and things like that. We have 3 or 4 webinars a year where people actually present their work. Those are recorded. They're also kept on that space so people can go back and look. We do semi-regular newsletters. Again, we try to do them like timely, so that we're reminding people of tools during work planning that can help them with work planning. During pause and reflect, what are the tools that we have on the site that can help, you know? So we do a lot of facilitation of that learning community. Like, you can't just throw a bunch of stuff up on a website and trust that people are gonna know where to look and go find it. So we really sort of curate that space. And it is, you know, for the people who are self-directed and can make the time to do that, it's very effective. But in groups that have maybe 70, you know, official members, how many people really are contributing and being a part of that conversation? At any given moment, maybe 5 or 10 are really engaged,
Yep.
and most of the rest are either lurking or just sort of not there. So it's like, it's a great first step, but our question is, so now what? And by the way, it's not like the USAID team has the time to do all the curation that we're doing, right? Like, that's why they hired us.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're nearing the end of nearly 10 years of this work. So who's going to do this next? And is it appropriate that they have to keep hiring? Like, what makes that community sustainable if none of those folks have the time in their own job descriptions to focus on learning, right? Which gets to those resource questions. Sorry, I went a little off topic there, but that's the example that we have, that we're, you know, we've gotten so far, but we're really struggling with how to continue and how to continue to succeed.
Yep. And that is an excellent example. I know of that example. It's touted quite widely about those groups as a way of learning. I've always been an admirer of, you know, how biodiversity does that and the like. But you raised a good point, is for an organization, for this to be kind of an organizational approach, it is resource intensive. Another model that I have also, you know, recently fallen in love with is the pivot model, which was is looking at, you know, the practical, innovative, on-the-job training. And so this was started by the Africa Bureau, USAID's Africa Bureau, and they're in their second year. And this idea was to create cohorts around folks focused on private sector engagement. So the agency has, you know, its private sector engagement, you know, policy and approach, and how private sector needs to be incorporated into things. A lot of missions were struggling with, how do we incorporate this? You know, this is an agency-wide policy. How do we, you know, what do we do? And so Africa Bureau came up with this plan where they have solicited, you know, in a similar fashion to what Lexina talked about, was they had solicited missions to apply to be part of this program and to be part of the cohorts. And what's really unique about Pivot, and actually here, let me, here is a link to one of their descriptions. And if you go onto USAID Learning Lab, you'll find many more. Hold on, let me put it. So they're in the chat. And so this model is really, you know, meant to be hands-on. So really, to a lot of our points, it's very practical. So their recognition was kind of along the lines, as part of the introduction to this session, was that learning happens by doing. You know, it's about experience. And so like 70% of what people, if you want this to be, you know, taken up, people have to be doing it, you know, themselves. And then there's another fraction that is kind of the network piece, where people are kind of working with their cohorts and sort of sharing information. And then there's a smaller fraction that is the training, you know, the kind of reading of documents and the like. And really, you know, understanding that ratio and then using that to inform the way you kind of structure those teams, and making sure that they are aware of what the level of effort is, and supporting all of that, and, you know, doing that. And as you can see, you know, kind of the pivot stakeholders, it is in that document, it is a large group of people that are kind of supporting this learning. That being said, they find it very effective. You know, they are able to kind of move the needle, but the question is, how long can you, you know, sustain it? Well, they're into their second year after this pilot. But really trying to think about, how do you optimize this particular approach such that you can, you know, you can spread that across an organization without, you know, breaking the bank, so to speak, and sort of thinking about how do you modify that. Thoughts on this particular model or models that people have seen that are similar? Any hands? Oh, yep, Roxanne?
I just wanted to note, because I pulled it up, and it just appears that each of those stakeholders has a stake in continuous improvement. And that is not always how it works. When you start a project, you don't know who has a stake in it yet. And part of it is gathering the interest and commitment of stakeholders. So I think it's a great model, and it has promise for long-term sustainability.
Yeah, and that's, again, my excitement about it is the fact that part of the requirements of actually participating in the program is that the mission director has to put the application in. The mission director has to say, we are committed to this program and we are going to put the resources towards it in order to participate, and staff time and the like. And so again, you have this level of buy-in on the staff side, of the organizational side, in order to kind of take this up and drive it forward. Recognizing, I guess they're going to break us down. Our group is going to disappear in about 6 minutes. Are there particular thoughts or action or lines of discussion we want to take down? Or is there something someone wants to put forward that we would discuss around this? Or should we continue on to, shaping lessons learned and how to write them? Any particular thoughts before I make a call?
I'm curious, Zach. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Denise, please.
I was just curious about, and I've heard people mention lessons learned management systems. I don't know if anybody has experiences around that.
I open it up. Others have experience with lessons learned. Roxanne, you had sort of, your description seemed to talk about a lessons learned system. Is that like it's a formalized process, or is it a system as well?
Right. Well, for the e-learning systems, because you are able to collect data, real-time data, in terms of how the adult learner and practitioner has actually used the information, etc. So it's a continuous improvement process. And also you can look at both large level improvements, but also micro improvements. You can, along the way, have lots of different improvements. So that's one way. The other is to actually organize your findings or your report in a way that allows for that adaptation, and also always continuing to use a sustainability plan on how financially as well as programmatically things can continue, like telemedicine, things like that.
Others?
This is Lexine again. I can share just a tiny bit about shaping lessons and getting staff to use them. We were struggling with that, so we actually recently did a qualitative assessment. We interviewed like 30 USAID staff in biodiversity, right? And about like, what are the key challenges? What do they know? What do they don't know? What do they need to know? And what we found that was really interesting is that there's a lot about, we know what things are, but we really struggle to figure out how to do it. So a lot more learning around how to do adaptive management, and like into the specifics. Which parts of the ADS support me in doing this? How do I rewrite a contract so that it allows for this, right? Like really technical, like how do you do this practically? And so we're trying to come up with innovative ways to meet that need, given all of the resource constraints and all of that kind of stuff, right? And then how to get people to use those lessons is, again, what we found is there's a lot of sort of structural enabling condition barriers. So staff don't want to be seen as charging down a new path. So how do we get leadership to set them up so that they feel like this is, not risky, or it's a risk they're willing to take, right? How do you set up incentives and reward structures for people trying to do these better practices, as opposed to like, I know how to write what I know how to write, and I'm just going to keep doing the same thing, right? And that's within USAID structures as much as it is, what an implementing partner is trying to do, right? Sometimes the implementers have a lot of ideas about how they would like to improve their work, share their lessons, et cetera, but they're constrained by the rules under which they're working.
And, you know, to that point, and I think you raised the key one, is leadership and leadership's role, and how it's a game changer in most instances. In most instances where I've seen organizational learning really be effective, it is when leadership has a role, leadership is there on the front lines, kind of at least breaking the path. They might not be involved in every sort of day-to-day thing, but they are there, you know, saying that this is the way business is going to be done. And, you know, for us as practitioners, that, you know, it is such a lift off the shoulders, and it makes things move so much better when you have that kind of buy-in from leadership and they are really responsive to that. If you don't have that, then again, I tend to find if you're outsourcing your learning for your organization, then it's going to really, the costs increase. And that the more it's not part of the culture, it's not seen as leadership, then the more it kind of moves out away from the organization, the more it winds up actually costing that organization to do, you know, lessons learned and, you know, capture their knowledge and learning.
Zachary, that's something I've also noticed. You know, if the executive buy-in isn't there, it's not sustainable.
Yep.
You have somebody coming in, director level, somebody who says, I'm committed to learning. And if they don't have that, maybe they're given the responsibility, but they may not be given the authority, which is where the resources come in. It's not sustainable. I mean, it's honestly, in part, is a path to burnout. And until that executive buy-in comes in, you know, it doesn't get the support in order for it to become a strategic advantage. And I'm talking with the private sector, particularly when I'm talking about that. So,
yeah, I agree. And I mean, for my example, for the evidence cycle, it's, you know, my supervisor is, you know, big keen on driving it. And then, you know, at the deputy assistant administrator, so our front office for the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, there is a champion in that, you know, position who is saying, this is the way we want to do business, and really pushing the whole rest of the Bureau to really adopt this approach and drive it forward. And so, you know, and another case of real good organizational learning is USAID Uganda. They really revamped the way that they kind of did, you know, and they really adopted collaborating, learning, and adapting, which is kind of USAID's approach to learning. But it was really driven by the fact that the mission director and then the director of the program office were really behind this idea and behind this effort. And they laid that groundwork, which then allowed staff to really find the time to be able to do it, you know, to that issue of, you know, where do we get those pause and reflects, the actual times to think and really sit down and contemplate these things and, you know, let learning seep in. You know, that was laid through that leadership kind of approach. And so that's really kind of a key piece at the organizational level, is to have that leadership to be driving that learning. Well, I think we're going to be broken up in a moment. I thought 50 minutes was a lot of time, but I guess it really isn't. Someone had a last comment?
Just wanted to say thank you for all of that input. That was really great.
Well, I appreciate the rich discussion and, you know, you joining the group. Again, like I said, I was like, oh no, I might be at a loss for time to fill the space, but we've come to the end, it seems, shortly. Are there any last points folks want to throw out there, or an example? I'd shared the pivot model. Again, there's multiple documents on USAID Learning Lab that I recommend you checking out around pivot, where they kind of describe their model, they describe their lessons learned. I think there's a whole report on their learning agenda, and very worthwhile.
Zachary, can I just ask you one thing? Is if you could maybe think about sharing what, you know, as you're moving on with your own exercises, to share that with the Sid Washington group, and maybe do a follow-on, you know, with your own experiences and sharing that. I think that'd be really rich and very useful for this group, because cool. I learned a lot from this discussion, but I think it's good to keep on checking in and sort of see how the process plays out.
No, that would be great. Yeah, I'll...
Maybe Pebbles can note that. I don't know.
No, that would be actually. I'm fairly excited about this particular process that we're embarking on, and so I think this would be a great audience to hear those ideas as we kind of begin to roll it out. Because we're coming up on our first test. Our portfolio reviews will be next month or the following, and the evidence cycle. This will be the first time portfolio reviews and evidence cycles are going to be kind of working together, hopefully. So we'll see how that goes. But great idea, thank you. Others?
I just want to make a plug for some other resources on Learning Lab. I would also recommend checking out the CLA Case Competition sort of collection of information. I think it's the result of 5 years of CLA Case Competition, and I think it's a good way to, it was a good way to capture lessons learned, and that Learning Lab found a good way to share them out using the sort of map and sort of tagging the different angles. And I think it's a really good, I'm personally invested in it, but I think it's a good way to share out some examples and lessons learned. And I think that people find it helpful.
No, I agree. I think that's a great example, Melissa. Thanks for reminding me, or reminding the group. One thing also that I like about it is that as a process, as well. So the lessons it actually captures, I think there's a lot of rich information there, but then the CLA competition in and of itself, just replicating that process at an organizational level is another approach for capturing lessons learned. So I think it's doubly, worthwhile. And additionally, what's another one? It just slipped my mind. We're on capturing lessons learned. Oh yeah, speaking in terms of what Lexine had talked about, having a learning agenda for your groups and sort of facilitating that conversation. Learning Lab also has a lot of nice resources around creation of learning agendas, but then also kind of the tracking of learning agendas. And that's sort of getting into how do you move from lesson identified to actually lesson learned. So a lot of what we do is we've identified this lesson. Oh yes, great. We need to do X, Y, or Z. Here are the recommendations. But then, making it learned, kind of to Barbara's point, making it actionable, making it something that people are doing, then that's really where the heavy lift is. And so we want to move towards lessons learned as opposed to just identified. And the learning agenda tools that are on Learning Lab help to do that. They've got a nice kind of template for a tracker of, here's the question we want to answer, here are the methodologies that we're going to use to answer that question, here's who's responsible for it, and here's, where the output is, and, what we are going to do in terms of a learning activity in order for people to kind of take that up.